This is Tamara Sale, and I am excited to be joining you today. I'm the director of the EASA Center for Excellence in Oregon, and we have a statewide early psychosis program here. But really, as I come into this conversation with you today, it's both in that role but also in my role as a family member. And so I'm going to draw on my own experience as we speak. I'm really glad to see some familiar names, and I'm going to encourage people to ask questions, to share your own knowledge and experiences, and as we move forward, to draw on your own experience base, both as a professional and as a family member, if you have multiple roles. So this webinar is hosted by both the EASA Center for Excellence, that stands for the Early Assessment and Support Alliance, and the National TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health. And it's funded through SAMHSA, so we really appreciate all the support that we've gotten. And we're going to spend some time today talking about the role that families play generally, understanding normal family reactions and how psychosis affects families, understanding how family psychoed plays in and the effect that has for families, talking about how to build meaningful partnerships with family members, and then also talking through some of the common challenges and some strategies for addressing those. And then finally, pointing folks to additional ongoing resources. So we're going to do a poll real quick. So this is a all that apply kind of thing. The question is, how do you self-identify? And I think one of the most important points here is that it's very common for us to self-identify in multiple categories. I personally grew up with psychosis in my family from the age of 15, and I have a daughter, so I'm a parent. I've had my own struggles. I'm also in the field of mental health, and so I play many, many different roles. So it looks like we've got quite a few professionals. About a fourth of the folks responding identify as family members, a couple folks with direct lived experience, and kind of a range of others. So I think it's important for us to recognize that all of those different roles give us knowledge that's important for the field. So let's go ahead and advance to the next one. And I know there's at least one room full of 30 people, so I apologize that we don't have the option for everyone to join in. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just briefly, about my own experience coming into the field. And I'm going to reference my brother a little bit. If anyone is interested in learning more about his experience, there's actually an article about him and my family in the Huffington Post. And I think the article itself, I think was interesting. It was pretty well written compared to a lot of media reports, but I think it's not really a very good portrayal of my brother. And I have to say that my brother is actually doing a whole lot better now than he was when the article was written. But I think it does kind of describe the journey that we went through. And for me, that journey was a real learning process, starting from being a teenager, first kind of learning about psychosis, to really having a career in the field, trying to understand, what was needed for people in our situation. And the exciting thing for me in working in the early psychosis field is that I feel like the things that we're doing are exactly what my family and what my brother needed. And so, we still have a ways to go, but I feel like we're very much on the right track. And I wanted to start out by just talking about why families are really important generally for early psychosis programs. One of the first things that is important is understanding that often people won't get to the early psychosis program without their families. In fact, if you start looking at the duration of untreated psychosis literature, family involvement is one of the most important elements in whether people get to care at all, or whether they end up basically coming through some other kind of alternative means. So it's unusual in early psychosis programs where the person's actually experiencing psychosis for the person to get themselves there independently. And most of the time it's the family that notices that something's wrong and that actually tries to get them to help. And if the family is not engaged, often it's very, very difficult to engage the family or to engage the young person. Also, family members observe a lot of things that the young person is not going to be able to report. And if you look at the diagnostic process for the DSM, there's actually an expectation for schizophrenia that there is observer information included in that diagnostic process, because the person may not be able to self-report the changes that they're experiencing because they're kind of in the midst of those. Also, families bring a tremendous amount of historical knowledge, and that includes obviously kind of how their experiences have progressed with time, the developmental progression, what happened when they were 3 or 10 or 11, and then also knowledge about the person's history related to the trajectory that they were on. So, for my family, we often have carried history when new professionals have come on board to say, hey, did you know that my brother has this long history of art. He's a really talented portrait artist, and he's extremely interested in ham radio, and the best way to engage him is to support his interest in inventing new electronic equipment and that kind of thing, and so having that historical knowledge about the strengths and interests, and then also, the things that have been tried and that haven't worked and the traumas that the person has experienced. Families are often the folks who carry that knowledge. Longer-term relationship and support for the person. So there are very few early psychosis programs that go on past 3 to 5 years, and most are quite a bit shorter than that. So when your services end, the family is really the support network that continues for the individual. And also, when you go home for the weekend, family members are not going home for the weekend. So it's, often the family members who get the calls in the middle of the night, or who are spending the whole day with the person, trying to figure out where they're going to live, and, taking them to Walmart and, buying, furniture and, doing all the things that, that families do for each other. And, also I think families are they're just an important social support network for young adults generally, but for all of us, and as we talk about families, one of the first questions that often comes up is, what about folks who are not supportive, where there's a lot of conflict, or people are choosing to move away from their family and not have anything to do with that family anymore. And obviously, those are potentially healthy choices that people may make about how they relate to their family of origin. But for all of us, it's important to have people who care about us kind of unconditionally, who are really there for us long term. And so, for some of us, we have close friends who become family, or, if we don't have a good relationship with our parents, maybe there's an aunt or an uncle or a sibling. So family, when we talk about family, it's not just necessarily always mom or dad, or what might be considered to be traditional family roles, but also incorporate self-defined family roles as well. So family is a place where people can come hang out over the weekend. I have a daughter who's in her 20s, and I'm kind of amazed that she actually likes to come over and watch Unbreakable with me on TV, which is a show that kind of makes us laugh. Or she'll come over and go barbecuing, and now she's asked me if I want to join a hiking group with her. So whatever's going on with her social network, she knows that between us and my mother, who's her grandmother, that she's got a place that she can go and just hang out. And the same is true with my brother. Our family is a very important part of his life, and he's a very important part of ours. Also, accountability around developmental milestones, and I really want to emphasize this because I think this may be one of the most important issues related to long-term disability in our system. I think we've historically set up a system where we push people from their dependence on their parents to a dependence on the disability system pretty quickly. And when you look at the process of growing up, it's really a whole series of negotiations for a lot of folks. There's some folks who just leave the state and never come back and become independent almost overnight. But then I think for the majority of people, they may live at home for a while. In our early psychosis program, the majority of people live with their family still, and that's still true at the point where people are graduating from the program. But there are very few of those families where that's the long-term goal. They really want the individual to live independently. And so, the process of becoming independent is one where often the family has to draw a line and say, look, we're really willing to support you, but we need you to take these steps forward for us to do these things that you need. And so there's this constant negotiation going on between the family and the person that the early psychosis program often plays a really important role around. So, the clinicians in the program and the peer support specialists often are coaching family members about, how to draw those lines and how to protect where there's a need for protection, but also really encourage the person to continue moving forward developmentally so that they don't get stuck in the place where they may be right now. And then families also are incredibly helpful in terms of advocating and kind of helping to get the word out, helping to change systems. My background includes a lot of work with the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and my mom actually helped to found the organization in Colorado about 40 years ago, and so I've observed over time the role that family members have played in kind of moving the system toward actually serving people with serious mental illness, and then jail diversion programs and crisis intervention teams through the police and housing options, and and they're continuing to play really important roles in early psychosis programs throughout the country right now. So I'm sure that there are many of us who are on the line today who have, let's see, okay, there we go. There are many of us who have our own young adults or teenagers who we've parented. So I'm curious, thinking about your experience raising a teenager or a young adult, is there anything that's taken you by surprise in that process? And I'm going to encourage people to type into the chat box. So just as an example, so I have a daughter who's 22, and her experience has been really profoundly different than mine at almost every level. So so someone is saying, the challenge of dealing with the behavior, the low ability of executive functioning skills, So often, when they're teenagers, you're like, how in the world could they behave like that? How can they not see how these things are connected to each other? And so sometimes they end up having to learn through really significant trial and error, which is way more painful than what you would hope for. So the desire to be independent without the skills to be independent, absolutely right. And so then they do a certain amount of crashing and burning and coming back to you. Attitudes and becoming more mature, self-identity. I think about my own daughter and how she's been, she's grown up so much, even just in the last 2 months, and I just like when she was really small, I see this, some days she's just like incredibly mature, and I'm just so excited to have this wonderful adult relationship, but she's still figuring it out. Lack of insight and medication compliance. So, figuring out for themselves, how these things interact with each other, and, having to, figuring out, like, when do you take medicine, making decisions about medicine, forgetting to take medicine, not wanting to take medicine, et cetera. And in fact, I have a really wonderful article that Pat Deegan wrote for us about her experience when she was a teenager and a young adult around choosing to take medicine, and how challenging that was. In fact, she talks about how at one point her friends told her, you're doing great, you don't need this, and so she actually dumped her medicine in the trash and ended up in the hospital. And so she had to learn through that. So another comment that becoming independent is not linear. There's a lot of exploration and testing before they become independent. That is absolutely true. And they don't necessarily become independent at the age that you think that maybe the age that you became independent, or in the way that you became independent. Extreme fluctuations between self-doubt and hyperconfidence. I suspect a lot of folks on the call are, reading these comments and thinking, yeah, I relate to that. Managing a child who is now an adult and doesn't understand that she has a mental illness. So that process of really kind of coming to understand the need for a team and, for addressing an underlying condition, often can take quite a long time. And so you end up kind of trying to, take responsibility for their safety at some level or their well-being, but, without them necessarily understanding kind of what is needed. And that's, again, that becomes part of the negotiation. Excellent work ethic and terrible study skills at the same time. Yeah, so we have this idea that, work ethic in this society means that you just try hard, but if you try hard and have terrible study skills, it doesn't matter how hard you try the night before the thing is due, right? So there are all kinds of developmental skills that people are just beginning to learn at the same time that they're dealing with the psychiatric challenges. And so it's just a very, very complex time of life combined with a very, very complex set of issues. So thank you, everybody, for sharing. Okay, so coming back to the slides. So parenting of a teenager and a young adult is complicated and challenging in the best of circumstances. We know there are all kinds of changes going on in the brain around, pruning and myelination and, things being wired to the frontal cortex where, they're learning to do reality testing in ways that they haven't been able to up until now. And that continues well into the 20s. And I want to encourage everybody to take a look at the work of Ray Simpson at MIT. She has two different websites, one on raising teens and one on young adults. And they're really wonderful resources, both for professionals and for families and for young adults, about how things are changing developmentally and the role that parents play and how that role is kind of continually changing throughout the course of development. And it talks about a lot of the comments that people were making about, gosh, this is not a linear process, that, one day or, at 11 in the morning, the person may be ready to be an adult, and then by 3 in the afternoon, they are ready to be a third grader, And I have to say, I'm not sure it changes too much in your 50s, honestly, because there are days when I'm ready to be a third grader too. And if somebody would let me be that, I might just really enjoy being there for an extended period. But, so people have already talked about, some of the challenges that are just inherent in parenting. Our kids are not us. So, my daughter adopted every value and preference that I rejected when I was a child. And so I had to rethink, everything that all my assumptions about, things like cheerleading and makeup and things that when I was a kid I basically rebelled against. Social media is completely different. So we've had really interesting conversations, where she's been texting her friends in the middle of another conversation, and we've talked about how her friends perceive that interaction as just as present and immediate as the face-to-face interactions that I'm having with her in the room at that moment, with all the same kinds of social demands. So if she doesn't respond right away, her friends are feel like she's being disrespectful towards them. Also, our parenting expectations really reflect where we've come from personally, the culture that we come from, whether we expect people to move out really young, get married really young, go to college or not. Those things all are very much affected by our own history. And then also, as we talked about, there's this kind of ambivalence about growing up and this need to set boundaries. And so under normal circumstances, parents disagree with each other about what they should do. Grandparents disagree, sometimes siblings disagree. And as you start adding mental health concerns, and psychosis in particular, those disagreements just become more and more intense. And so often by the time an early psychosis program steps in the door, there's been really significant family conflict going on for quite a while. Especially during that prodromal period where there may be early symptoms that are affecting the person's ability to learn in school, affecting their ability to do the things that they're expected to do. And so the parents often, or the people surrounding the individual, including the school professionals, often are really pushing the young person in ways that they're not actually able to perform. And of course, we're all coming into this with very little instruction to begin with, and every challenge that our young person has, we tend to blame ourselves, and others are very willing often to step in and blame us as well. So it's a really, really difficult transition for everyone, and there's so many aspects to it. It's kind of daunting when you think about it. All of the skills that people have to learn, trying to actually pay your rent and get groceries and pay for those groceries at the same time that you're having some kind of social life with other people. And families play absolutely central and critical roles for many, many young people in this process. And at the same time, in a healthy family relationship, part of that is also appreciating, who this person is, some of the things that are really special and different about them, and also what they've accomplished, so, and going back, knowing there are times with my daughter where I'll remind her of, her accomplishment at the age of 3, and how what she's doing now really reflects that same kind of persistence that she showed at a really young age. And, oh, by the way, I know that you're capable of being successful, and I'm going to set some boundaries that are based on that understanding. And at the same time, when you run out of grocery money, you feel free to raid the refrigerator and come over to dinner. So negotiating expectations, performance, and then, also, we often in our programs have young people who may have decided that they don't want to go to the same church as their family anymore, or they don't believe the same things their family believes. And so, that's just all part of the normal process, making decisions about gender and sexuality, things that may lead to conflict and changes in people's perception about kind of who they're going to choose as their long-term family, or what relationship they're going to have. Obviously it's all very complicated, and then you throw in psychosis. And we talked a little bit about how psychosis has this kind of gradual onset where there have been all these changes and people are trying to explain it. There may be drug use going on in addition, which makes it even more complicated. But generally, when you have a person coming into an early psychosis program, often the family has been going through a lot of turmoil leading up to that you're now going to help them to understand and explain at a different kind of level. By the time they are diagnosed with psychosis. That generally means that they've lost their ability to tell what's real from what's not. Often with families, they have absolutely no idea what's going on, except that the person's behavior has changed really dramatically and in ways that are very frightening. And there often is a tremendous and real concern for safety, both physically and then also in terms of our sense of reality. So for me, going through psychosis when I was a teenager, I actually ended up really not sure what was real and what wasn't. It was a very, very frightening experience. Getting calls in the middle of the night, not knowing kind of what behavior was going to be happening, having, picking at one point, having my brother was actually jumping in front of cars on the freeway, and I got to sit in the back seat and accompany him to the hospital, and that was a major traumatic experience that 20 years later I was still kind of working through. And in that process, throughout the process of him becoming ill and going through these crises, I would go to various adults and explain what was going on, and they had absolutely no idea how to help or what to say. I was given the option of going to foster care. I had someone express concern about my own well-being in the middle of it, in terms of whether I might have a nervous breakdown, is the term the person said. And so I ended up just talking to my best friend for about 5 years before I could finally find an adult who didn't say incredibly stupid and useless things. And I got to say, I was 15 years old, and I knew that what these adults were saying to me was incredibly stupid and useless. I know they were saying what they thought was going to be the most helpful, but I sure could have benefited from an early psychosis program where people actually knew something and could explain that this was a common experience and be part of a team where we were working through these things together. So all of this just leads to tremendously strong feelings, confusion, just terrible anxiety about how the young person is doing. Sometimes, sometimes these experiences can involve terror. For those of us who are in early psychosis programs, we see some of the behavior. If your young person decides to leave their shoes and their money behind and go off across country, or if they decide they can fly, or decide to go wander into a river somewhere, or start to think that you're hurting them, these are extremely frightening experiences, potentially traumatizing for everyone. And it's incredibly important for professionals to have empathy around these experiences. Family members routinely say that every day in the beginning feels like a year, and I think that's really true. So I think we're having some trouble with sound. Can people hear? So Bev and Kelly are saying that they're having trouble with sound. So let me do a sound check real quick before we go on. Okay, so some folks are saying they can hear. A couple of folks are saying their sound is cutting in and out. So Bev and Kelly were saying they couldn't hear, but a bunch of other folks are saying they are not having a problem. So this is being recorded, so we'll for folks who missed part of it, I'll let the folks at the Institute kind of work through that. So there are many things in that acute period that are can be really traumatizing, and then generally as a person is struggling in school or struggling with normal adult development, there can be a lot of concern about whether the person is going to be able to make it. And then on top of that, there's a natural grief process that most family members go through, as do individuals who experience psychosis. And that grief process and the grief cycle can directly affect people's behavior. So they can go from being angry to being an advocate, all over the course of a week. And I remember a few years ago when my brother was in the hospital, and I was talking to one of the staff people there, and I was just experiencing this tremendous grief and this tremendous, just kind of sense of being overwhelmed. And she said all the words to me that I say to other family members all the time. And I kind of laughed and I said, I say exactly what you're saying to other people, but it doesn't keep it from being real to me. And I think one of the things you have to really watch with for family members is that grief, if it doesn't have a place to be expressed, and if people don't have a way to kind of work their way through it, can contribute to longer-term depression. And also, of course, if the person had depression to begin with, all of these experiences and these emotions can contribute to pre-existing conditions as well. So just being really aware of the very powerful impact that this has on families, and the need to be present with them very quickly in the beginning, and paying attention to who all is in the family. So not just the one parent who shows up, but also the sibling who might be not showing up, or the other parent who may or may not be coming. And then sometimes we also see just frustration, people getting angry because the system is not responding the way they need to. There are very few times when I'm talking to a group, if I don't, when I share the words, there's nothing we can do until the person is an imminent threat to themselves or others. I don't think I've ever used those words in a room where people haven't recognized them. And so, when we're talking to our clinicians in our programs, we emphasize that these are not words that we use. We don't say these words because there's always something we can do. Even if we're screening a person out from services, we can problem solve. We can help with making linkages. We can provide information. Maybe we can't involuntarily commit them right now, but there's always something that we can do. And so all of this, over time, can really affect people's health, any kinds of stress-related conditions. It can be exhausting. People end up taking time off from work, sometimes for extended periods. It often leads to relationship conflict. I was watching a independent lens movie on public broadcasting by a woman by the name of Nan-Fu Wang, Nanfuwang, called I Am Another You, and it was about her experience following a young man who was homeless. And well into the film, she tracked down his parents and interviewed them, and it turned out that this young man may very well have been a person who could have been in an early psychosis program and benefited from it. And the parents had divorced each other because of the experiences that they had had. And that is incredibly common. And so, as we think about early psychosis programs and what we're treating, in addition to the symptoms, often we are preserving relationships and families. It's also very easy for families to lose a sense of where their young person's future might go, their ability to actually, either support themselves or have any kind of career. And so part of what early psychosis programs do is to help people hold on to a positive view of the future, and also, really pay attention to the developmental progress or process that everyone is going through. So if you've got a 15-year-old in the family, there's a really good chance that person's going to grow up to become a mental health professional, because they are at that developmental stage of figuring out where they're headed in their life, and this experience is likely to affect their normal development. My dad was ready to start a business of his own. In fact, he had already launched it, but he went back to his previous employer because of the health insurance concern. My parents kind of gave up on the idea of ever having the kind of independent life that families often aspire to when their kids grow up. And as a sibling, I had a realization that just because you have a kid doesn't mean the kid ever grows up and goes away. And so I delayed having children because I knew that it was a lifetime commitment. So just being aware, that these things, these experiences have tremendous impacts, and it's very important for clinicians and peer support specialists to be very aware and attentive and gentle with those experiences. So families need rapid access. They need support really quickly. We know that the highest risk period for people experiencing psychosis is right at the very beginning. And so families really, really care about rapid access. They also need people who are going to spend time to listen to them in a non-judgmental and a supportive way. I've been surprised that there are folks who we've screened out of our program where we've gotten incredibly positive feedback from the families. And in fact, one of our major donors is a family member whose child was screened out of the program. And what they say is just the level of support, the level of listening, the level of problem solving, and the intentional kind of linking to additional services can be incredibly important for people. People need some kind of context about what's happening. Most people coming into it really don't understand what psychosis is. They need basic coaching about how to communicate. So, we often encourage people right away to learn about kind of Xavier Amador's LEAP model, listen, empathize, agree, partner. It's just really being very intentional about communication, not negating the young person's experience, but also, kind of helping to kind of move forward and partner. Figuring out how to help. I posted a link to our practice or to our family guidelines, which we give people from the very first time we meet them often. Things like, it's okay to let them spend time in their room. You don't have to, it's okay for them to have space. It's important to maintain daily routines. It's actually a good thing to do the things that are healthy for you. So if it's gardening, or if it's staying engaged with your church, those things are actually an important part of the recovery process. And then connecting them with both the resources of the team and also other resources in the community. Problem solving, again, really encouraging self-care. Family members often just decide that self-care needs to be deprioritized, and they don't even want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it because they're so focused on the young person. So we have to reframe things for them so that they understand that self-care is actually part of the recovery process for the young person, and that sense of hope for things getting better. So, peer support at that point can become incredibly important for families, to meet other people who have been down a similar road and actually found their way. I just want to talk a little bit about language, and I think no one uses language to be intentionally hurtful or to mental health professionals are they're in the field for a reason, but there are terms that get used sometimes in our clinical settings that then get transferred over to families, and we don't necessarily recognize the emotional impact of those terms or the underlying connotations of them. So the term dysfunctional is used quite a lot, and truthfully, I think we probably all are pretty dysfunctional at some level if we were to really examine our own behaviors. And of course the term is just, doing stuff that's not really working, right? But, there's a connotation under it, which is that this is a bad family. And of course, families often are thinking about, oh my gosh, what did I do to cause this? And so using a term like dysfunctional can really reinforce that. And even if we're using the term when the person's not in the room, it starts to kind of underlie our thought process. And families and people who experience psychosis are often very, very sensitive to those kinds of attitudes. So, another couple of terms that I hear pretty often are like smothering or helicopter parent. And again, sometimes we use those terms in kind of a gentle way, and we might even laugh and say, yeah, boy, I can totally relate. I'm like trying to, I'm like watching my kid, did you do what you need to do? And, so it is a natural reaction. But the terms themselves are potentially harmful for family members because, again, it suggests that there's something wrong with you as a parent, It's certainly not person-centered language, and it, again, it has these connotations that you are causing the condition. And in fact, often, hypervigilance or, just really trying to know what's going on is, it can be, just a normal parenting reaction, and it can also be a reaction to, fear that, is the person okay? And, not knowing where to draw that line. And so, really problem solving and normalizing with folks that, the natural reaction is to try to, make sure the person is okay, which means that you're wanting to check in on them constantly. And there may actually be times where it's important to do that. If the person is genuinely at risk of suicide, or if they're, if they're so into their psychosis that, they're thinking they may need to set fire to the house or something, there are times where that kind of very intense monitoring may actually be needed. But then there are also many times where it's not needed, and so I think, and most of the time it's not needed. So the team has to kind of engage with the family to kind of help them figure out how to keep the person safe, and how to maintain boundaries that allow the person to continue to recover and to grow. But just avoiding some of those terms in that process, I think, is really important. I already talked about the imminent threat thing. Families don't hear that term usually unless they are in a major crisis. And so that term gets dropped in right at the point of crisis and can create trauma and just kind of lasting damage in terms of people's feeling of isolation and kind of sense of hopelessness. And then, the family psychoed, interventions that we do, talk quite a lot about expressed emotion and the role of expressed emotion and exacerbating symptoms. And, what we have to be careful about is just understanding that not very many years ago, there was this whole model of causation called the schizophrenic model, where professionals actually believed that family members were causing schizophrenia through their behavior, and so there are still people, including my own family, who have directly experienced what it was like to have professionals who had that belief system. And so, again, just really thinking of it in terms of normal reactions, that families are doing the best they can under the circumstances that they have. Expressed emotion is both a cultural thing and it's also a normal family reaction. And also, it's helpful to kind of try to moderate that, because young people are very, very sensitive, when they're experiencing psychosis, to distress, to pressure, to anger, and even to really high levels of enthusiasm. And so just helping people to understand that part of psychosis is this high level of sensitivity that's not only sensory to the environment, but also there's a sensitivity to expressions of emotion and of whether it's positive or negative. And so, families have to kind of work on developing some different ways of approaching it. And that's also true for group home providers and for clinicians. So family psychoeducation is absolutely a core element of every early psychosis program. And if it's not, then it should be added to the program that you've got. There's some really well-researched models. The one that we use in EZI is the one that was developed by Carol Anderson and Bill McFarlane. But family functional therapy has also been used really successfully. There's lots of research showing really significant impacts on things like hospitalizations and just recovery outcomes generally, as well as impact on family burden. Family psychoeducation really, is an important strategy for engaging families, for giving them very concrete strategies of what they can do, how they can cope, helping them understand, what's going on, reducing anxiety, conflicts, learning how to communicate, and then, figuring out how to problem solve. So, and there's a question about could titles for those books and resources for the family therapy be provided? Absolutely. I can send out a couple of references as a follow-up to the group. Okay. So, so for those of you who have been through family psychoeducation training, this will be very familiar to you. And so, when you're doing a formalized family psychoeducation approach, these elements are important. But also, I think they translate even when you're not doing formalized psychoeducation, from the time that you first interact with the family. So, the first thing is engagement, really paying attention to who's in this family, actively reaching out to them. Often they don't really understand that they play an important role. or that you're there to support them. And so making sure that they understand that, making sure they understand your treatment philosophy, how you approach things. Harm reduction often is something that families are really uncertain about, so really helping them to kind of understand how the program works. And then spending time really listening to them, understanding their context, and giving them information, guidelines, support, helping to, listening to them in a way that kind of helps to connect back to treatment. And that's true both for the family member and for the young person, that the family member may be the one who shares information that helps you engage the young person, because they can tell you, these are some things that I know that he really cares about, or, here's what he's been talking about. And also, for the family members, often they're worried about, gosh, how do we, help him get back into school or pass his classes, or, how do we reduce our conflict? And so you're listening, you're helping them connect their experiences back to treatment and the education process, and then you're giving them, you're connecting their experience to this kind of knowledge that they're having to learn. And that's also just really around, we use this term joining, so it's both listening but also kind of helping them to recognize that they are in a partnership with you, and that, that you're there to support them and that you need them in that process, and so encouraging them to show up. Really looking at, in treatment planning, what are the expectations and needs that this young person has. So, the young person might say, I really want to focus on getting a boyfriend, but the parents are saying, I'm going to kick you out of the house if you don't get a job, right? So that's important information for you to understand, because, yeah, the boyfriend might be one goal, but the employment might be another, and the young person might not be as excited about the employment goal as the boyfriend goal, but the family really needs that to eventually happen. And you may also be encouraging them to kind of slow down the pressure on that, to say, that is a really good goal, let's really work on some steps in that direction, but can you, provide a little bit of additional support in the interim while that's happening, knowing that this is going to be more challenging at this point in time. Shared decision-making, so that you're supporting the family and the young person to kind of come to agreement about what to do next. And, just generally providing context and information. I find the structured family psychoeducation process to be extremely helpful. Both the educational process, the guidelines themselves, groups where you can get one going. That really can create a social network for the family. I know of at least 2 multifamily groups that meet independently after all the families graduated from the program and have been meeting for an extended period. The structured problem-solving process itself, which includes, a check-in, what's gone well, what's the challenge, really choosing that challenge strategically, articulating the problem so that it's both kind of accurate according to the person who owns it, behavioral, potentially solvable, and then going through a process of brainstorming, evaluating pros and cons, choosing which strategy, and then coming up with a really specific plan. That is a skill set that is developmentally incredibly helpful for young people, and also really, really useful for families in working their way through some of these challenges. When I started doing family psychoed, I actually brought the method home and started using it with my own daughter, who is a teenager, and it was incredibly helpful. And in fact, she still uses it on her own, and when we get into conflicts, we'll actually do it as a family, just to because it works and it's really effective. and then, of course, families continue to play a role, whether or not they're in a family psychoeducation process. Eventually, young people are going to transition. Families are going to play a really critical role there often. Your program doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are private insurance issues. There are issues of what goes on in the hospital. Families become advocates who then lead to system change. And also they provide a really important ongoing social network for themselves, as well as providing support potentially for other people as well. My mom has a really lovely ongoing relationship with a woman who lives in the town who's been homeless for many years, and her family member lives in another state. And they connected to each other through NAMI. And so my mom has actually, been a friend to this woman for over 30 years, and, continues to be a resource. And so it's just that family network can be incredibly powerful. So starting to get into some of the Q&A and discussion, first of all, let me ask you all, is there other information that you think is really important, or areas that I didn't touch on, or resources that you might recommend? And, I encourage you to go ahead and use the chat box for that. And in the meantime, I'm going to just kind of walk through a few questions that I know people are going to ask, because they always do. All right? So the first question is, what if the person doesn't want the family involved or won't sign a release? And of course, that's not an uncommon scenario, right? So the first thing is that we do talk with people about the role of family and the role that family plays in their lives, in terms of financial support, or kind of being something that is an important resource for them. And so we encourage family involvement from the onset when we first meet with people. So there's a culture around it. We also talk about the importance of family support. So even though the family might not be actively involved in the person's treatment, the family also might need information and support. So the main thing that we do is we really talk to the person about their relationship with the family, kind of pros and cons of including them or involving them, what it would mean to sign a release, really talking about their power to determine what kind of information actually gets released. The fact that just because there's a release signed doesn't mean that that the professional is going to share everything that they say with the family member. So just really exploring kind of what the person is comfortable with or isn't, and kind of going from there. So we had a young woman who was in the hospital who was going to be released back to her family, and wouldn't sign a release. And so the strategy that we took with her is just to, again, keep talking about, okay, what are your concerns, and what do you actually need from your family? How could your family help you? And so we were able to, she made the decision to sign a release so that we could talk to her family about her clothes, because she didn't have any clothes. And then from there, we were able to get a release to talk about money, and to talk about kind of living situation. And then gradually she just kind of added information to the release, and that worked really well. The other thing is that we do maintain kind of an open door for families. So families call us, and we we share information with them about our treatment program, about the kind of common experiences of psychosis, family guidelines. You don't have to be in treatment with us to get that information. and none of it is specific to the individual. So we also talk to families about releases of information and confidentiality, and kind of what is required to be able to share information, so that families understand what needs to happen, and so they may also kind of come at it from their own angle. And generally we take kind of problem-solving point of view. So, where it's becoming an issue with a family, we may bring it to clinical consultation and have people share strategies that they've used. So I think that's really often that's really helpful. So we've got a few comments here. At Peace in Philadelphia, they're working with families who are in a lot of poverty, and often the young person is not the top priority. People are kind of overloaded. Absolutely, that comes up a lot. And so they're kind of looking, hoping that you'll kind of fix them. And sometimes they have their own kind of mental illness on top of it. So sometimes it's much more difficult to support the young person. We're offering multifamily group, but often families stop attending after a week or two. Becomes difficult to follow up from the previous group or to build on what's learned. Any ideas about how to tackle some of those challenges in family work? I'd encourage everyone to share their thoughts about that question. I think the issues of poverty, also multiple caregiving, where you may have like a grandparent and another sibling. You may have multiple folks in the family who all require caregiving. We've had parents who have both their own psychiatric conditions and also brain tumors and medical conditions. So absolutely, that does make it much more of a challenge. I think in some of those cases you end up really problem-solving family issues and challenges in addition to the issues that the young person is dealing with. And so you may have to actually focus in on the barriers that they have to participating. And also extending that family network for the young person, really looking at, what other resources do they have, maybe really thinking in terms of a broader team for them. How does that family get support? There have been times where we've actually focused in primarily on the family's needs. We had a couple of young people where the young person actually refused treatment at all, and in one situation the family was dealing with a major medical condition, and that supporting them in their medical condition became our primary focus, and actually was the way that we engaged the young person in treatment. So I think that's a really important set of issues, and worth exploring in some real depth. So I'm going to, let's hold on to that and think about maybe doing some additional kind of conversation and consultation around it. What if parents are in denial and or against medication? So some of that's cultural, some of it is just genuine fear of what the medication may do. Some of it may be grief, previous experiences. I think really, really listening non-judgmentally without any kind of assumption about what the family should believe or should conclude is really the important place to start. So again, thinking about even the term denial, it kind of presumes that we really know what's going on. But if you take more of a cultural lens to it and think about how does this family view the situation, what do they think is going to be helpful? Are there ways that we can actually work with that? And then kind of sharing information gently with them. Really exploring their concerns about medication, their previous experiences. We have a number of families in our programs who have had either a family member or like maybe a grandparent or an older sibling, who had some really bad experiences, either with the system or with medication, so knowing about that becomes really important, and then it allows you to take a psychoeducation strategy around it. So understanding kind of what's underlying their thought process, what they think is going to be helpful, and then again, thinking in terms of shared decision making, about this is how we would normally approach it. Here's what we found has been helpful. Kind of working through that process. And again, I think this is another area where clinical consultation could be really helpful on an individual basis. But these are really, really great questions, and I'm thinking we probably should, come up with some kind of an iterative tip sheet with everybody's ideas about how they respond to these. How do you address potential violence with the individual when options are often incarceration or hospitalization? Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the guidelines, one of them is violence is just never okay, that you have to draw a line around violence and be really clear about what you're going to do. We do sometimes facilitate hospitalizations because we're concerned about safety. And we do it unapologetically, but also try to kind of do it in a way that's respectful and honest and direct. The hardest thing is when a person is really in need of a hospitalization and unable to access that, which unfortunately families deal with quite frequently, and so do early psychosis teams. So, addressing potential violence, there's so many aspects of that. Part of it is really working with the family in partnership. If you're dealing with a crisis situation, the HIPAA requirements are different. If you actually think this person is in danger, the release of information issues are not the same as they are in a normal situation. So generally there's a little more ability to communicate. And basically you are really addressing those issues of violence as directly as possible. We have had people choose to move out of their house temporarily, which is not something that I would normally encourage. But at the point where they did that, they were in constant contact with our team. We were in constant contact with their crisis response system, and we were kind of staying with it until it came to a resolution. So that's a really important question, and also, again, really listening to the family, really listening to the young person. So if somebody's just come out of the hospital and they're saying, "Gosh, there's spirits in the attic," and I'm afraid of them. If the person's saying things that are about something they're afraid of, really understanding what are the risk factors there, what are they thinking they might need to do in response to that, and being really, really proactive as much as you possibly can be in a respectful way. But again, this is where families really need you really need families, and it's a partnership with everyone. We've experienced several families of both teens and young adults that once the person is connected with services, the family disappears. They'll show up for family group, family therapy, collateral sessions to provide psychoeducation and often won't return calls. Any suggestions to re-engage them? Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, if a family has been in crisis, sometimes the fact that the young person might be doing better, that you're providing support, may be like the moment where they can finally take a deep breath and take a little vacation. And at some level, that's probably a good thing and okay. At that point, I think what I would probably do is just really focus on the young person and talk about what's going on with family. Sometimes the young person is the catalyst that brings the family back. So if you've got a family workshop coming up, if the young person is saying to their family, gosh, it would be really supportive of me if you come to this, that's going to be heard really differently often by the family than if you're the one making the phone call and they're not returning it. I think this goes back to that poverty issue and also just the level of kind of work responsibility that a lot of families have. If you've got a family that is struggling economically where they may have be working really long hours, and just having difficulty, that kind of persistence can be really important. Just continuing to invite them, thinking about reaching out at different hours. So if you know something about what time of day they're working, that may mean that you have to call them at night or on the weekend, which, again, kind of pushes our system boundaries. But generally, to engage with families, we often find that you have to be available in the evening. Most of our family psychoed groups are in the evening or on the weekend. How can I better support the rest of my team in making referrals of families to family support and multifamily group and identifying the need for family support? Yeah, that's great. So I think this is a training issue for the whole team. So providing the team with some basic training about what family psychoeducation is, what it does, the types of issues that it's helpful for, so that, if you've got a psychiatrist who's meeting with somebody and they bring up, gosh, we're really having some conflict around this issue, or I'm really having trouble with, studying for this test, or I don't know what to do about friends, or, whatever that is, that becomes an opportunity for the other clinician to say, that's actually a perfect kind of issue to bring to family psychoeducation. That's exactly why those groups exist. So again, it's a form of joining, encouraging the person to connect their lived experience back to the opportunity that you're presenting to them. So, I think these are really great comments and really reflect an intentionality of your teams in engaging with people and some of the real challenges. Another thing that I might encourage for some programs that might be experiencing this more universally, so there may be some cultural issues or, some issues that are particular to your community. You might try something like a one-time focus group with families, just kind of bringing some of these questions to them and asking for their suggestions, so taking kind of a quality improvement lens to it. We looked at our data at one point. We collected data about who from families were involved, and realized that we had very few fathers involved. So we actually did a focus group of fathers that turned out to be really, really well attended, and it was some of the most rich feedback that we had ever gotten. So sometimes that kind of one time, would you be willing to come to a focus group, it might get them to the table enough that you can start to understand what their perspective is. Okay, so sometimes we'll hear we're not including families because there's a lot of family conflict, and sometimes that can make engagement a little more difficult, but that's exactly the situation where you most want to engage families. In fact, that's what led to our dad focus group, because we had a couple of adverse events where we traced it back to conflict that was going on in the family, where the young person was getting a lot of pressure around working, and was really reacting with a lot of distress around that. And it had to do with conflict among family members who were not showing up for anything. So, the family psychoed actually was designed with family conflict in mind. And then abuse, of course, comes up as an issue, and the response to that is that you have to look at what the engagement with the young person is currently with their family network, and kind of decide what makes the most sense. Obviously you're working with the young person, but you're looking for family connections that are not abusive, right? So we had a multifamily group where we had a young person come with her aunt, and one of the things that the group problem solved around was basically how to maintain boundaries with an abusive family. And it was incredibly supportive for the young person. The aunt played a really, really important family role that in other cases a family member, parent might have played. So any other questions or ideas that people might want to share? And I'm going to just kind of give you some resources that are really, really helpful. NAMI obviously is a big one. NAMI Minnesota developed a booklet specifically for family members who are experiencing early psychosis. The National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors has information specifically for family members as well as about family psychoed. EASA has a whole family and friends section on its website. Excuse me. The Federation of Family for Children's Mental Health has some great resources. Both of the two RAISE programs, Navigate and On Track, have developed whole family manuals that you can download that are really helpful. The Anderson-McFarlane model was translated into a toolkit through SAMHSA and is available online. And, of course, the Peer Training Institute also provides family psychoed training. Okay, so let's see. All right, a couple more questions. Since we are community-based, they're usually open to work that is done at their home at the, let's see, but I cannot get anyone to come to our family psychoed group where they would find amazing support with one another, ideas on how to get them to show up there. That's great. So the fact that you're able to get them to connect with you at their home is a really great step, and you're already providing them with a lot of information. You may be providing them with a lot of the same kinds of psychoed that they would get. This might be a point where you might think about engaging family peer support, so that they could be involved in some of your outreach. Obviously, that's not a role that most folks have. But, again, this is really a joining issue. A lot of people are very hesitant about groups generally. So understanding what that hesitation is, what that concern is, understanding if there's a timing conflict, and you're never going to get 100% of the folks to the group, but I think also just really kind of emphasizing again that what this group does, and how it addresses the concerns that they're bringing up. I think, again, just being persistent is really important. And there are times where there are cultural issues. So Amanda asked about families who have English as a second language, Vietnamese and Spanish, any recommendations for incorporating them. We actually use simultaneous translation in our workshops as well as in some of our groups. And where we've had enough of a critical mass, we've actually had Spanish-speaking multifamily groups. I don't know if you have enough people to support that, but we've had really good success with simultaneous translation. So, I would look into that. And, of course, making sure that anything that you're handing out to families that you've translated into the relevant languages. Any other suggestions? There have been so many good questions that have come up about, how to engage families who may have, economic concerns, who may or may not believe that, believe in treatment to begin with, who are really ambivalent or even opposed to medication, issues of safety. I think all of these things really illustrate why families, engaging families is important, but also that it's often not an easy process. But one thing I would say is, when you're sitting in your team meetings, look at how much content is there under under families, and not just family psychoed, but families generally. What I find often is that part of the reason that teams struggle is that they're not actually focused on it as much. So even just shifting the focus a little bit sometimes can make a really big difference. And then also using your whatever consultation is available, using the broader network to say, hey, I've got this scenario, what suggestions do people have? There's a lot of experience around these issues in the PEPNet network. And I should add that if you have not yet joined PEPNet, that is an incredibly rich resource, PEPPNET. You go to, if you do a search on that with Stanford, you can join PEPNet, and people often send out questions to the group or make suggestions about webinars. It seems like we might even want to think about like a follow-up webinar that would focus on some of these more kind of advanced topics. So thank you, Diane, for following up on the English as a second language or monolingual issues. We often have interpreters in our MFG sessions. Our interpreters are instructed to sit by the person and interpret directly to and from them quietly. It's worked quite well and keeps everyone involved. Yeah, that's been our experience as well. Different firms, different translators have different kind of technology around that. But I definitely observed that it generally works really well. So we are at 10 o'clock, and this has been an incredibly rich conversation. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your questions. I'm going to take them back and think about them some more. I am thinking that maybe a follow-up webinar, that's really more scenarios and advanced topics might be a really helpful thing. And if people have additional questions or ideas, feel free to email those to me. There's my email address, salt@ohsu.edu. I see we still have a couple folks typing, and follow-up around strategies would be helpful. Okay, great. Yeah, so, so if there are individual situations where you'd like some additional TA, we could talk through some of those, and then, we'll definitely think about, how to provide some more in-depth guidance and support around some of these questions. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for your commitment and your great work, and look forward to continuing to work with you. And there's an evaluation that's going to pop up, so please go ahead and fill that out. And have a wonderful week. Great talking to you. And look forward to seeing you all in person someday, maybe October 7th at the IEPA pre-conference. So I guess that's it.